Thanks very much, Kim, and thank you for the organisers for the session, and thank you for the audience for actually coming and wanting to learn a little bit about sea level. I'm going to run quickly through some of the main conclusions from the most recent chapter on sea level from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is not something one does on their own. I had a team of people working with me. I was one of the two co-convening lead authors. My fellow co-convener was Peter Clark from the USA, and then there's a list of lead authors below that. Collectively, we are responsible for this chapter, and we had contributions from roughly 50 other scientists from around the world.
Can we get closer to the microphone, please?
Okay. Can I get this a bit higher? Is that better? I was actually asked right at the start to say something about the IPCC since there's so much misunderstanding about what IPCC is and what the process is. Okay, the Intergovernmental Panel, it's an intergovernmental panel. Its role is to produce assessments of climate change science and to produce policy-relevant but not policy-prescriptive assessments. It consists of a small secretariat, and there's 3 working groups currently, one on the science, one on the impacts, and one on mitigation. And there's also a synthesis report done which brings together all of those 3 reports. The panels select scientists from around the world, or they are nominated and then approved by governments. So in 2009, there's a group of scientists from around the world selected to write the 5th assessment report. Our charge in doing that is to find robust findings in the science. We're not actually there to do new science, but to assess the existing science as published in the scientific literature. We have to rely on multiple lines of evidence. We can't select pieces of evidence that suit us, but assess all of the evidence, weigh it, and come to an overall assessment of what is our best understanding. And clarity of communication of this information with our target audience, principally government policy makers and governments, one of the key requirements. The process for me started in 2009 in the last report, although of course there was planning before this, when a scoping meeting was held, and that agreed on the overall outline of the 5th assessment report. That was followed by a sea level workshop, and that was because sea level was a very controversial issue in the 4th assessment report, because many people, including many scientists, were concerned that the report was interpreted as projecting sea level rise, which was far lower than many scientists expected to occur. That was followed by 4 lead author meetings. We produced a 0th draft, a first draft which went out to scientific review. This was open to scientists around the world to review it. You had to register, but you could, it was relatively easy to do that and submit comments. A second draft following that, which then went to government and scientific review, and in both of these steps, my chapter received about 1,500 comments. We have to respond to every single comment. We don't have to accept them, but we actually have to respond to them, arguing our case as to why, yes, we should adopt this comment, or why this comment is not appropriate. And then the final plenary, the summary for policymakers, which is a short synthesis of the total report, is approved on a line-by-line basis by governments around the world, and they accept the full report at the same time. Overall, a very arduous process for me, starting in 2009, still ongoing as I'm an author on the synthesis report also. So very demanding, and very demanding on a large number of people. Okay, so what is the report? This is the front cover of Working Group 1. It's a very thick report. You don't want to drop it on your toe, you might break it. But it is broken down. As I said, 2009 was the outline approved. 259 authors, lead authors, contributed to the main report. In total, about 55,000 comments from over 1,000 experts around the world. It consists of 14 regional chapters and an atlas of regional projections. And that's preceded by a technical report, which is about 100 pages long, and then a summary for policymakers, which is about 20 pages long. So that's quite accessible for many people, and I'm sure all of you could understand that. And the summary for policymakers also has within it 19 headline statements which contain the essence of the report. And so that fits on 2 pages from this 6 years of work from 260 authors. It's all available on the web, including all the reviewers' comments and our response to those comments, freely downloadable. So now I'm going to move to sea level. I'm going to quickly go through the main results from the report, and I'd invite you to ask questions about any details in the discussion sessions. And then I'll also talk briefly about Australian sea levels. So the first conclusion was that in warmer climates, sea level was higher, and similarly in colder climates, sea level was lower. So the rate of sea level has increased over the last 200 years. This is our summary diagram from the end of the chapter, which shows sea level, our estimates from 1700 through to 2100. So the various lines and data, which we'll come back to, show this increase in the rate of rise starting in the 19th century. The rate of rise during 1901 to 2010, or the amount of rise, was 19 centimetres, and we estimated somewhere between 17 and 21 centimetres is our uncertainty estimate for that period. The rate of rise will increase under all scenarios, as indicated by the blue and the red lines, starting from roughly 2000 into the future. With scenarios, what do I mean? We are not there to decide what the world should do in response to climate change, how we should change our emissions. What we make is assessments based on some assumptions of how the world could evolve. The red scenario shown here is for a more or less business as usual scenario where the world fails to mitigate their emissions of greenhouse gases. In contrast, the blue line shown here is where there's major mitigation efforts by the world, efforts that we are not on track to meet at this stage. We present the evidence. It's up to the world to decide how they want to respond to this. One of the big uncertainties, both in the last assessment report and will continue to be the case into the future, is the fate, particularly of the Antarctic ice sheet. The Antarctic ice sheet contains over 60 metres of sea level equivalent. Part of it is grounded below sea level, and there's been concern for a long time that that part could be unstable to rising sea levels and warming ocean temperatures. Our assessment is that if such an instability was initiated, and it wasn't clear that it would be initiated during the 21st century, then the rise by 2100 would only be several tenths of a metre above the projections as shown in the right panel. Increases in sea level lead to a more frequent occurrence of high sea level events as affecting the coastline. And sea level will continue for many centuries into the future, well beyond 2100, even for our lowest greenhouse gas emissions. The ultimate amount, of course, is dependent on future emissions of greenhouse gases. So now looking at the history, a little bit more detail, this shows sea level over the last 140,000 years, estimated from various pieces of climate information, from corals, from sediments, etc. In the last interglacial, roughly 120,000 years ago, sea level was higher than it is today, and the best estimates were somewhere between 5 metres and 10 metres higher than present-day sea level. Greenland contributed significantly to that, but it can't explain all of the higher sea level, implying additional contributions. Ocean thermal expansion and loss of glaciers around the world is a relatively small amount, so the implication is that there was some contribution from the Antarctic ice sheet as well. And that occurred at temperatures about 2 degrees Celsius warmer than current day and slightly more than 2 degrees Celsius high latitudes. These are temperatures we'd expect by 2100, particularly in the higher greenhouse gas scenarios. Sea level then fell by over 120 metres into the last glacial maximum as major ice sheets formed over the northern hemisphere continents, particularly North America, Northern Europe, Northern Asia, and then rose rapidly for many thousands of years at rates of 1 metre per century or more, with peak rates of 4 metres per century, so well above the 1 metre per century, which is the average over that period. Then sea level stabilised about 6,000 years ago, and this occurred when the major ice sheets that were then covering North America and Northern Europe and Asia had fragmented and melted. And our society has really been developed, our coastal society has really been developed over this period of relatively stable sea levels of the last several thousand years. And if we focus now just on the last several hundred years, this is a blow-up of part of the summary diagram. Shown in blue and the various coloured lines are estimates of global average sea level around the world over this period, and the dots with the lines through them are estimates from various paleo indicators, so indicators from corals, from sediments, etc. They indicate that over the last several hundred years, rates of sea level change were only several tenths of a millimetre per year. From 1901 to 1990, that rate increased to about 1.5 millimetres per year, with the uncertainty range between 1.3 and 1.7. And then from 1993 to 2010, that rate increased further to 3.2 millimetres per year, and that's confirmed both by the satellite measurements that Ed mentioned and also measurements of coastal sea level around the world. Both indicate this increase in the rate of rise over this period. But note, there were also higher rates of sea level rise early in the 20th century as well, which we believe are related to natural climate variability and additional contribution from northern hemisphere glaciers in this period from 1920 to 1950. We have a much better understanding now of the reasons for sea level rise and a much better agreement between the various observations and our understanding and the models based on that understanding. The best understood component is warming of the ocean. As you warm the ocean, the waters expand exactly like a liquid in a thermometer, and as a result, sea level rises. The oceans have absorbed over 90% of the heat that's been absorbed by the climate system over the last several decades. Changes in mass of glaciers and ice sheets. Glaciers around the world have lost mass. Together with thermal expansion, loss of mass from glaciers are the two largest contributions for sea level during the 20th century and over recent decades, and explain much of the rise. We have reasonably good understanding of how glaciers respond to warmer temperatures, but because there's very many tens of thousands of glaciers around the world, our observations are inadequate, and we have to use the available observations to try and estimate the total loss of mass from glaciers. Loss of mass or gain of mass from ice sheets. So Greenland is definitely have increased surface melting since 1990, and a total loss of mass has increased since 1990, both from surface melting but also from the flow of glaciers into the ocean from Antarctica, from Greenland. For Antarctica, a much more complex situation. We would expect an increase in mass of Antarctica from increased snow accumulation. A warmer world means increased snowfall and therefore increased mass accumulation on Antarctica. That's generally not yet been observed. There's some indications just recently that we might be seeing the first signs of that. But what we have seen is an increase in flow of glaciers from the West Antarctic ice sheet. So that's the part of the ice sheet that is grounded below sea level, an increased flow into the ocean, and that's accelerated over the last 2 decades. There's also liquid stored on land. We mine water from aquifers, so aquifers have become depleted around the world, but we also store water in dams through the building of things like the Three Gorges Dam in China and other dams through the 20th century. So these anthropogenic stores from dams and aquifer depletion are important for understanding the 20th century, but they're not major contributors to the 21st century. They will make some contribution, but they're not the dominant contributions. And as Ed referred to, all of us people living on the coast are interested in relative sea level. That is, sea level measured relative to the land. But of course the land is not stationary either. The land is moving in response to climate changes, both present climate changes and past climate changes. Satellites measure the height of the ocean relative to the centre of the Earth, and so we need to differentiate between these. And our projections, we've been careful to try and put our projections in terms of relative sea level to make them more accessible to people. Of course, the regional distribution of sea level is not uniform. Changes in ocean currents, changes in the mass distribution of the Earth change the gravitational field of the Earth, resulting in a relative change in sea level around the world. How has our understanding improved? As I said in the introduction, an important aspect of our assessment is assessing the observations, assessing our physical understanding of those observations, assessing model representations of those, and trying to test those models that we would then use for projecting the future. This shows the period from 1990 up to 2010. The blue and the red are observations of global mean sea level from satellite in red and from tide gauges around the world in blue. And our models, the average of our models that we've used in the fifth assessment report in black, showing a general agreement between the observations and the models of global average sea level change over this period. And this is quite different from the last report, where the models underrepresented the observed sea level change. Similarly, going back to the period since 1960, there's overall good agreement between the models, shown here in black, and the various estimates of sea level shown in the three coloured curves there, and the satellite altimeter in red. However, this is not a complete test of the models we use for projections, because it includes the observed contribution from the ice sheets, whereas all of the observed dynamic contribution from the ice sheets, that's the flow of ice into the ocean, but it includes all of the other components from the models. These are our projections from essentially from 1996 through to 2100 for, again, the two different scenarios we talked about, a mitigation scenario of high emissions of greenhouse gases, a sea level rise of between 53 and 98 centimetres by 2100. The rate of sea level rise in the last couple of decades of the 20th century is large, 8 to 16 millimetres per year. That's approximating the rate of sea level rise in the last deglaciation of the Earth from 20,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago. So very large rates of change. A major mitigation effort for the lower scenario in blue, a sea level rise of 28 to 61 centimetres by 2100. And there are a couple of other scenarios we could talk about if need be. I talked before about the potential for rapid increase in ice flow. There's concern by scientists and others around the world that the West Antarctic ice sheet could be potentially unstable. It's grounded below sea level. Well, as shown here, the bedrock on which the ice sheet rests get deeper as you go back from the ocean. This allows, and the formation of ice shelves allows warm ocean water to penetrate underneath these ice shelves, melting them at their base, allowing them to slide more rapidly into the ocean. And this is a potentially unstable process. There are some counteracting processes which might mean that this is only a theoretical instability, but it is a reason for concern. As I said, we've assessed this situation. It's not clear that this will happen during the 21st century, and if it did, it would only be several tenths of a metre in addition to the contributions in the previous slide. However, current evidence does not allow us to quantify either the timing or the magnitude of any larger sea level contribution from the West Antarctic ice sheet in the period beyond 2100. There are projections of larger rates of sea level rise which we also assessed. These are from statistical models that relate the observed rate of sea level rise to observed variables such as temperature or greenhouse gases. These are shown by the bars compared to our process-based models, our models based on understanding of the physical processes for 2090, shown in the grey shading. All of these models, or almost all of these models, give a larger rate of sea level rise than in our projections. There's not an adequate understanding for the reason for the difference between these two sets of projections. It's often pointed to our lack of understanding of ice sheets as the reason. However, that explanation doesn't seem to be justified in that during the 20th century there's a relatively small contribution from the ice sheets to observe sea level rise, and therefore it can't be entering into the scaling that's used for the projections. As a result of this, there's low confidence in these larger projections of sea level rise by 2100. And this was quite a discussion point in our topic, and it took a long time to come to an agreement. However, it is virtually certain that beyond 2100, under all of the greenhouse gas scenarios, sea level will continue to rise. So I've shown three bars here for a very low emission scenario. On the left of each of these sets of bars for the various time frames. Only on the lowest emission scenario would we be likely to limit sea level to a metre. For business as usual, we're talking about metres of sea level rise over coming centuries. How long have I got? Sea level rise is not projected to be uniform. There are a number of different contributions to that. Firstly, there's the ocean dynamics, the type of things that Ed referred to, of climate dynamics, modes of climate variability. We're all familiar with the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which has such a big impact on Australia's climate. That type of mode affects the regional distribution of sea level rise. Some of the common features from these models are a lower rate of sea level rise near Antarctica, band of high sea level rise running through the southern extremities of the Indian Ocean and to some extent the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and similarly a high sea level rise at about 30 degrees north in the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, with a minimum in sea level rise in the region of the southeast Pacific from the southeast trades. This is only one contribution to sea level, regional sea level change. When you change major mass distributions on the Earth, as shown from the two panels here, if you take ice from the ice sheets, shrink those ice sheets and allow that water to flow into the ocean, you change the loading of the Earth locally. And so what happens is the land actually rises, and so locally sea level falls when the ice sheets lose mass. And this is actually one of the stabilising mechanisms on ice sheets. But it also changes the gravitational field of the Earth. And so water actually flows away from the ice sheets, and you get a larger than average sea level rise in the far field, in places like Australia in the South Pacific, than in the immediate vicinity of the ice sheets. It's not a huge impact, but it is significant. And that's what's shown on the two panels on the right, the glacier mass loss and the ice sheet mass loss. These are what's called the fingerprints associated with changes in loss of mass from the ice sheets. So the bottom panel on the right is loss of mass from the ice sheets, and you see that around Greenland and around the West Antarctic region, the Antarctic Peninsula, sea level is actually falling and rising in the far field. There's another very important component for understanding 20th century sea level rise, and that's the response of the land to changes in mass distribution since the last glacial maximum. There are very large ice sheets on the North American continent, for example. When they were removed, the land locally, for example around Hudson Bay, rose, and that leads to a fall in sea level rise, or fall in sea level that is continuing today. In the neighbouring regions, for example New York, the mantle is actually flowing away from that region and back to where the ice sheets formerly were. So places like New York are having a larger than global average sea level rise, and places in the far field like Australia are actually having a slightly smaller sea level rise during the 20th century than the global average. And this is one of the explanations why sea level along the east coast of Australia is slightly less than the global average during the 20th century. We can put all these components together and do projections of sea level rise, and they're shown for 4 different scenarios here. Turns out that for most of the globe, the sea level rise is relatively uniform, and if you look at the coastlines around the world, something like 70% of the coastlines have a sea level rise within 20 centimetres of the global average projection. So the global average projections actually are a good and useful indicator, although I think these days we can do slightly better than that. Okay, I wonder how long? Yep. I just want to finish off with a few comments about Australian sea levels. This is the satellite altimeter record and the tide gauge record since 1993. Sea levels around Australia during this period have been rising larger than the global average, particularly in the north of Australia, and about equal to the global average in the south of Australia. Off the southeast coast of New South Wales, there's a larger than global average rise in the offshore region. We believe that's not affecting the coastline, it's an offshore feature, and that at the coast sea levels are rising at about the global average in southern New South Wales. And the reason for this larger rise to the north of Australia is climate variability. This shows a picture of sea level rise over that period, larger rises in the western Pacific and small and even sea level falls in part of the eastern Pacific. And this is associated with the transfer of mass from the eastern Pacific to the western Pacific over this period. This is part of a natural cycle. There may be a signal here from anthropogenic climate change as well, but that's not been established as yet. These are the sea level records from 1965 around Australia when we have almost global coverage. You can see common features in many of these records, particularly on the north and the west and the southern coasts of Australia, and these are related to El Nino Southern Oscillation events. So this large coherence in sea level around Australia. If you take those signals, remove the signal associated with ENSO to the best of our ability, correct them for the vertical land motion and changes in atmospheric pressure, then the trends in the unaverage case, which were 1.4 and 4.5 millimetres per year over 1960 to the present and 1993 to the present, then become 2.1 and 3.1 millimetres per year. These are quite close to the global average rise over that period. The projections, we're now working on regional projections for Australia. These are very similar process to the projections in the IPCC report, and they're shown here for the 4 scenarios. And if I focus strictly on Port Kembla, which is the closest location we have for projections, shown in black is a historical tide gauge record, and the 2 projections for the high and the low scenarios for 2100 through to 2100 are shown by the red and the blue bars with the uncertainty estimates. Okay, I think I've been through the key messages, but we might put those back up later on if to remind people what they are. We have 2 options into the future. We can mitigate, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore reduce the amount of sea level rise, both during the 21st century, but particularly beyond. But we will not be able to stop all sea level rise. Sea level will continue rising even under our most severe mitigation scenarios. So we will need to adapt. There's basically 3 options to us. We can retreat from parts of the coast, and shown in the top left picture is an example of retreat from the coast occurring in the UK, where it's become just too expensive to protect the coastline. We can accommodate, and Carl showed a good example actually, of a structure which is built to experience storm surges, so people in Bangladesh, where this photo is taken, can retreat to these storm surge shelters during periods of cyclones, and that saved many hundreds of thousands of lives in Bangladesh through this accommodating for sea level rise. And we can protect parts of the coastline, and we will do that. Shown here are the examples for the Thames Barrage in UK and a barrage in Rotterdam. Where there's expensive infrastructure, there's over $1 trillion of assets being protected by the Thames Barrage. And there are methods for estimating what allowance is appropriate to make for future sea level rise, so that risks today, and we all have coastal risks already, so that they are not increased with sea level rise. All of the information from the IPCC chapter is freely available on this website, as is all of the other chapters from the IPCC report.